Hello family and friends, welcome back. So last couple of videos I've been asking what's changed or what has changed. And we know what changed. But in this video nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. So I'm going to read from the chapter. I'm going to skip some pages on from the chapter Strangers and Slaves Turned Neighbors. And this last section in this chapter is entitled Black Neighbors, White Strangers. At Lincoln Inn Fields, London, Sunday the 13th of April, 1645. 1645. At Lincoln's Inn Fields, London. So it goes straight into somebody's writings. He's taken a quote from somebody's writings. A newspaper article, actually. It being not upon the subject of Mars, which is our business, but of Venus and Bacchus, it's a strange custom in Lincoln's Inn Fields, not far from the Portugal ambassador's house. The practice we conceive every way as bad as any that were used when the book of recreations commanded or permitted May games and revellings. There gathers many hundreds of men, women, maids, and boys together. Then come neggers. So it's basically niggers, but with an E, N-E-G-E-R-S. I suppose that was the old British way of saying it. And others of like ranks. These make sport with our English women and maids. Offer in the Venetian manner by way of introduction to that used in their stews. Stews, okay, I've got this. Stews means brothels and houses of ill repute. There gathers many hundreds of men, women, maids, boys together. Then come neggers and other of like ranks. These make sport with our English women and maids. Offer in the Venetian manner by way of introduction to that used in their stews. Why these black men should use our English maids and women upon the Lord's day, or any other in that manner, we no reason for, but the truth is, the fault is wholly in these loose persons that come there, and in the offices of those parishes where it is done. This extract is from the article. It's from an article in the Moderate Intelliger. It reported on events that took place in London on the 13th of April 1645 at Lincoln's Inn Fields. Africans were described as active participants in these forays. The writer described these Africans as morally culpable because they had sexual relationships with our white English women, as Thomas Rayner later reported in 1692. With us in England, a Moor might marry some little drab or small coal wench. The English do not feel hatred and aversion to the Moors, and are therefore willing to marry them. And we know that in England, throughout the early modern period, marriages and relationships did occur between people of African descent and white English people. But Raymer prescribed and limited the class of white women that married African men to drab and coal wenches. But these terms did not reveal the diversity of women involved in inter-ethnic unions in early modern England. And ironically, the writer of the Intelligencer confirms this. However, the writer in the Intelligencer was not complaining about the marriages between Africans and white people, but unsolemnized relationships. Unmarried, basically. The writer called these activities a practice, and he pejoratively described these Africans involved as neggers and black men. But he did not blame them. Instead, the writer accused the other loose persons that attended and criticized the officers of the parish for not stopping the immodesty. However, a re-examination of articles reveals that the writer was less concerned with ethnology and more interested in questioning the morality of his early modern society. The reason for this was because the moderate Intelligencer was anything but moderate. It was a Puritan and Republican periodical that pioneered what we may now call the tabloid press. During the English Civil War, it sought to encourage opposition against King Charles I, with its tales of military victories against the royalist forces. This same publication was later to call for the execution of the king. The events here that the writer described were part of customary activities that happened throughout England. Some of these events were part of a spring or May Day festivities, which were an integral and popular aspect of English culture and had been for a long time. John Stowe wrote about them in his survey of London and described that on the Lord's Day, people revelled all day and absconded from church. These events were linked to Morens and Moorish dances that had become part of English culture. As the diary of Henry Machin tells us, the Morays dance, and then many minstrels, and after the sergeants and yeomen on horseback. Then came the dullo, the devil, and sodans, and a sodan. So a sodan is basically like somebody of stature, somebody of position. It's like a slang word for South Dean, like in the Shires up north. Somebody of authority. This spectacle was also presided over by a lord of misrule. By the middle of the Tudor period, a certain theological license was given to these activities because of their popularity, as attested in early modern books such as the Popular, The Husbandman's Recreations, that the writer colloquially referred to as the Book of Recreations, colloquially. Informal conversation, common local terms, the common tongue, slang. The Husbandman Recreations, that the writer colloquially referred to as the Book of Recreations. So as I found this super interesting, I had to start Googling some of these words. This book was written by John Rhodes, the minister of Enbourne, in 1588. Rhodes wrote about how dance was permissible in spring to celebrate the creation. But by the Stuart period, spring revels had become an opportunity to loosen morals in a bacchanalian fashion, with sexual licentiousness exercised in public parks and spaces. The notorious libertine John Wilmot proffered precisely this sort of revelling in his poem, A Ramble in St. James's Park. These dissipations were features of early modern English society and persisted even when Puritans took over the government. In December 1644, this government had enacted ordinances to limit, restrict, and curtail festival days that included spring celebrations and Christmas as a feast of giving liberty to carnal and sensual delights that had no warrant in the word of God. However, the opposition to these ordinances saw spring and Christmas events celebrated with greater vigor, sometimes on an ad hoc basis, specifically for that purpose, when needed. So anytime there was a celebration, this behavior broke out. Any excuse. The opposition to these ordinances saw spring and Christmas events celebrated with greater vigor, sometimes on an ad hoc basis that flouted the government's restrictions. The libidinous prodigality at Lincoln Inn Fields can be seen as an example of that resistance. The fact that they chose the largest public square in London may have underlined that intent. So, Lincoln Inn Fields, Holborn, you got the road High Holborn, you got Holborn Station here, and then you walk down towards Aldwych, where the theatres are. There's the Waldorf Hotel, India House, and then basically Holborn, High Holborn, Aldwych, down the road round the corner, Waterloo, over the bridge. So that road leading from Holborn to Aldwych, just go halfway down it and then turn left and there's Lincoln Inn Fields. It's all tennis courts now. Oh, where's my neck? The fact that they chose the largest public square in London may have underlined that intent. These sorts of revels that mocked these ordinances were common throughout England. So why had the writer focused on events at Lincoln Inn Fields? The answer lay in the fact that the fields were opposite the Portuguese ambassador's house. The writer attempted to incriminate the Portuguese ambassador Antonio de Souza with the activities in question, perhaps to tarnish his reputation. The ambassador was a Catholic and a Marano, a Jewish convert to Christianity. Another clue there. And more importantly, he was a personal friend of Charles I. The writer of the article may have sought to stir up xenophobia, not necessarily against Africans, but the ambassador as a foreigner and a religious other, and in turn smear the king. You see, there was great distrust about the Spanish and Portuguese. See, all these kind of things pieced together in that period between... You know, guys, you know. A Jewish convert to Christianity. But the ambassador as a foreigner and religious other, in turn, smear the king. Lincoln Inn Fields were also located near government offices, so it may be that this frolicking was being portrayed as a danger to the moral health of the state. The writer described hundreds of men, women and children, in other words, families and communities that reveled together. Then he reported how Africans arrived. We are not sure why they arrived later than the rest. And the way that he described them suggested that they were all African men. Black people time. uh, then he reported how Africans arrived. They were not sure why they arrived later than the rest. And the way that he described them suggests that they were all African men. The writer then stated that these Africans all make sport with English women. When this is happening, it is unclear what the white English men were doing. Perhaps the writer wanted us to use our imagination to assume that the English men were voyeurs, as he is, pimps, or only interested in having sex with other men. The last point is not as speculative as it seems. During the early modern period, Lincoln Inn's Fields was frequented by men who engaged in homosexual acts. Now, this book has tons of asterisks and numbers here, so you can go and check out the references and the notes which this guy has used. Now, seeing I've said that, for the sake of any white men listening, I'll refer to that. Okay, 134, 134. Sorry, it's got so many. Come on, I saw it. Sorry, bear with me. I've seen it. One, 4, 3. Sorry. Okay, here it is. And just so you know, I'm not messing about. One, 4, 3. Right at the bottom there. Gay men would frequent the public toilets in Lincoln Inn Fields. See Kate Chegzoy, Emma Francis, Murray Pratt in A Queer Place, Sexual and Belonging in British and European Context, Aldershot, Ashgate, 202. This tradition continued into the 18th century. See Richter Norton, Mother Clapp's Molly House. The gay subculture in England, 1700, 1830, Los Angeles, California. Nell Gwyn also lived there, and it was close to the to theatrical performances and other entertainments in the town square. See Arthur Holborn Marks' historical notes on Lincoln Inn Fields, Hereford Record, 1922. Remember this thing used to go on late 80s, early 90s. What was it called? Cruise In or whatever? I don't know, man. It was a long time ago. There's nothing new under the sun. So, the writer wanted us to use our imagination to assume that the Englishmen were voyeurs, as he is, pimps, or only interested in having sex with other men. The last point is not as speculative as it seems, as during the early modern period, Lincoln Inn Fields was frequented by men who engaged in homosexual acts. However, the events described by the writer were not what they seem. The writer accused the Africans of lewdness in the Venetian style. The last phrase was a euphemistic way of labeling as foreign the sexual activity that occurred there. Of course, we know that these types of revels were congruent with English mores. You see how he started this thing saying, oh, he's not actually complaining about race. He's complaining that they were unmarried and it's in public and blah, blah, blah. But, okay, I'll give you that. I'm not going to accuse anyone. But that's also how covert racism is done. If you know who you're informing this kind of, you're reporting to, and making it specific what type of people, you can easily create an uprising, an uproar, stir up hatred. You know, it's all about how things are reported. But I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. It's like, if I were to say grooming gangs, what's the first thing that comes into your head? Exactly. Of course, we know that these types of revels were congruent with English mores. People heard it in the gossip and the banter. You'd hear this kind of behaviour in people's conversations, people talking about their weekend and what happened at the pub last night and stuff. So it's not something that the Africans are doing any different. Everybody's partaking. And as before, he tried to say that these white women were coal wenches and they were drab, but really there were other more reputable courtesans, young ladies. Partaking and turning up and probably young men as well. So the activity is normal. It happens anyway, but it's reported in a specific way. The writer tried to manipulate his readers' emotions by proposing that white English women would be enticed by African men into more sexual activity in their stews, brothels and houses of ill repute. These stews were the secret, private dwellings located in the poorer section of London, where some African men lived. Where? I want to know where. Where? Remember, it's 1646. I want to know where. Nevertheless, despite the offer of illicit sex in the future, the actual gregarity of this soiree offered a public spectacle. That was a spectacle that did not seem to have included rape or sexual abuse, even though we do not know how young the boys and maids were. Setting that equivocation aside, these activities seem to be very different to those carried out by the masters and overseers on plantations in the Americas and elsewhere. On those plantations, in the masters' houses, and all along the byways, systemic abuse was profligated. White men were the chief protagonists and patriarchal purveyors of that abuse. However, by contrast, in early modern England, in Lincoln's Inn Fields, African men were the central figures in a sexual cornucopia. So, like a house of plenty, fullness, lavish, luxurious, common slang words, cornucopia, the good stuff. So these African black men, they owned clubs, bars, brothels, houses of ill repute, and they were very popular places, basically. African men were the central figures in a sexual cornucopia predicated on a voluntary lasciviousness. It did not appear to have been an expression of male patriarchy, but something else. The communities that attended these jollies may have actually been bound together by these strange customs that took the form of low ritual. Low rituals are particular to their communities and show who belongs. It's a working class thing. These are our ends, this is our manner, these are our people, we get along, we're very similar, we're partying together, we understand each other. There's no snobby, pompous twats here. It might be looked down upon, it might be very what's the word? Unbecoming. But to these people, working class people in these streets, it's just the norm. Nobody cares. In their communities and show who belongs. The Africans did not belong to a community or communities of peoples that, according to the writer, were numbered in the hundreds. The writer, we presume, a white man, did not belong. He was an outsider, the other, the stranger that stood on the fringes of this ethnically diverse neighbourhood in London's 17th century England as a frigid bystander. In order for us to see Africans such as those portrayed in the Intelligencer clearer, we need to contextualize them into the times in which they lived. More than 300 years ago, the writer of this article, despite his prejudice, had acknowledged Africans as present in English society. This is something that many modern writers are yet to do, and this myopia creates a mismemory that erects insurmountable barriers to the notions that Africans and Europeans could be historic neighbours and share the same living spaces. As the author Shobon Katago states, Mismemory is not necessarily forgetfulness, nor is it an outright lie. However, a mismemory borders dangerously on mythology. This mismemory can be buttressed by a fascination with the romance of Tudor and Stuart England, not the history of early modern societies. We have many books intoxicated by the romance of this period, and few on the history of multi-ethnic communities such as that described at Lincoln Inn Fields. This is not just neglecting the history of Africans, women, the poor, etc. It is actually indifferent towards the real history of England. Many of the historic peoples that have populated these islands are ignored. We make them into strangers. We do not know them. Perhaps they were never as strange as we made them. When we commit to understand them, they become less strange and more familiar to us. I don't think I need to say any more. That says it all. So that's the last excerpt from this book. It was very hard to read the first two videos. I know, I apologize. But this last video, I think it sums it up. And I think we understand the overall. But for me, I'm just dying to know more. I'm just dying to know more. Especially that period 1646. And how people were reporting this. It was outside the ambassador's house. There were many important people who lived around there. People didn't like it. You know, people must have seen like people there. People must have heard gossip that somebody was there, and they're like, oh, what are you doing with these people? You're not supposed to be there. It's like today, like when you see somebody, okay, not today, back in the day, because like I haven't been to a club for probably 3-4 years. And even then, 3-4 years ago, when I went to the club, I just sat there drinking with my friend. I just wanted to talk, and I told you that's why I had to break free from my friend, because he didn't realize that us going out for a drink, I'm not gonna partake in certain things anymore. But back in the day, basically, you go to certain clubs and there would be certain people from certain circles, certain Essex girls from the rich side of Essex, or certain girls from sunny Kent, like from the rich parts, in certain clubs where you wouldn't expect them to be. Nothing's changed, nothing much changed. But 1646, the Great Fire of London, 1666, where were these houses of ill repute? Because that fire, it was a huge chunk of the city, central London, like, ah, oh, man. And it ended just outside the Holborn St. Lincoln Inn Fields, because from there you got the Strand, and from the Strand you go onto Trafalgar Square and Whitehall. So that's very interesting where it stopped. And I'm just dying to know what kind of places, where did these guys live? I'm not saying anything, I'm just asking the questions. It's just really, really, really interesting. See you next time.